perfectly normal way to defeat a boss, right? Today on ADG Pro, we're going back to the original Descent once again, this time to investigate just how good its arsenal is, as the game presents the player with a selection of 5 primary weapons and 5 secondary weapons, seemingly to be utilized to fit the various combat situations which are encountered. Well, at least, that's the theory. The question we're going to answer today is, do the weapons have situational usage, or are some of them completely overshadowed by the rest? I mean, let's be real here. Watch any person play this game normally, and they'll probably be trouncing around with the plasma cannon and homing missiles as their primary armaments for most of it. I mean, do the lasers really lose their usefulness once you've got the venerable power of plasma? What about the spread fire cannon with its triple firing shots, or the fusion cannon which you can charge up? And sure, the smart missiles and mega missiles are unquestionably powerful and best suited to certain situations, but just how powerful are they by comparison? Now, I know what you're thinking, just look up the weapon details online. And normally my response to that logic is that these ADG Pro videos are specifically about attempting to distill this kind of information out of a game with a minimum of external resources. However, this time around, I decided to go online and attempt to confirm my results after the fact, only to discover that it's practically impossible to find solid data about the Descent weapons. Descent 2, easy. Descent 1, not so easy. But part of the problem is that when the Descent source code was released, the raw data included, which details all of the stats, was for Descent 2. And even then, because the data is related to Parallax's own editor and not the game engine itself, it definitely feels like there's some inconsistencies between that data and what my own testing revealed. And extracting the real data values from the game's resources is virtually impossible. I spent several hours making the attempt and ultimately had to give up. I imagine it probably is possible, but requires intimate knowledge of the internals of Descent's data handling, and that's not something I have. That said, there was a lot of data which did line up well to my results, and it helped to unveil a couple contradictions I ran into along the way. So, with everything said and done, I'm about 95% confident in the results I came to, and some of them are quite revealing. So first, let's figure out how we're actually going to go about doing this testing. To start with, we're going to be heavily abusing Descent's many cheat codes to pull this off. More specifically, the Ahimsa and Big Red codes to stop the enemies from attacking and to give us all the weapons. Though giving us all of the weapons adds an extra complication in that there's 4 different levels of laser cannons, plus the ability to upgrade them to quad firing over dual firing. So we're going to have to get a little creative in testing those aspects. I decided to start things off roughly by clearing out the space around the level 1 reactor, plopping down a save, and seeing how many attacks it took from the basic level 1 lasers to blow the reactor. The answer is 13. Okay, interesting. Not a number I would have normally expected, but also not very high. So my next thought was maybe to try blowing the reactor with flares. Because of how dark some of the levels in Descent can get in places, a mechanic called flares was added so that you could launch a flare at a surface, have it stick for a while, and that flare would provide a source of light. However, flares technically do damage as well, as if you hit an enemy with one, it will generate a damage effect. So I tried taking out the reactor with only flares, and ended up completely draining my energy reserves. Okay, so got a refill, went back to the reactor, resumed the assault, and ultimately ran out of energy again. Getting a little disheartened following the second refill, but hey, let's keep trying. I mean, if the flares are doing any damage at all, and eventually...
Self-destruct sequence activated.
Okay, actually managed to take out the reactor using only flares. Totally lost count though, so I scrubbed back through my footage and counted out each and every flare, and ended up with 251. That's a curious number. So curious, I recounted again and again, got 251. Interesting. I then repeated this test, but hit the reactor with a pair of level 1 lasers first, then used only flares to finish it off, and ended up blowing the reactor after 231 flares. So yeah, this actually revealed something which I already sort of suspected going into this all. In Descent, you don't get destroyed until your hit points drop below 0. Landing on 0 exactly does not count as dead. Suffice to say, this is something I was going to have to watch out for going forwards with further testing. It also occurred to me though, given how few shots it took to destroy the reactor, that I might want to try blasting it with the fusion cannon just to make sure it can survive such an attack, and of course, fusion cannon freaking annihilates the reactor in a single shot. Yeah, this thing's not going to be the most ideal for testing, so what are my options now? This is when I had the quote-unquote brilliant idea of testing the weapons on the level 7 boss, which usually serves as the final boss of the shareware version of the game. Now, with the Ahimsa code in effect, the boss shouldn't end up attacking me at all, which means it should be a perfect target for laying into with... oh... Okay, so if you attack this boss, it initiates a teleportation to elsewhere in the arena. You know what, that's fine. I just have to moderate out my shots more carefully, and that could also make it easier to count all the individual shots after the fact. Furthermore, the lava down at the bottom of the arena helped to allow me to destroy myself and scatter weapon power-ups everywhere, mostly for the sake of being able to selectively decide which level of lasers I wanted to be using in a given moment, and whether or not I wanted them upgraded to quad firing. I did have to use the Bruin code in a couple instances though, because I wasn't paying close attention to my lives count, as I had kind of forgotten that the original Descent has limited lives. In any event, the working theory so far, based on the 251 flares it took to blow the level 1 reactor and the 231 flares it took when coupled with a single pair of level 1 laser shots, is that the level 1 reactor had 250 hit points, a pair of level 1 lasers can do a maximum of 20 points of damage, and that a single laser in that pair does 10 points of damage. With this knowledge in hand, I decided to count out how many pairs of level 1 lasers it would take to destroy the level 7 boss, and after a while it turned out to be 101. That's very curious, because we know things don't explode until they drop below 0 hit points, and 100 pairs of level 1 laser shots would be exactly 2,000 hit points. So I decided to test this again and counted out exactly 100 laser shots, then fired a single flare at the boss. Yeah, I didn't actually fire 2001 flares into the boss. This boss has exactly 2,000 hit points. Now, knowing that should make testing the rest of the weapons a lot easier. I mean, I'm presuming it'll make testing the weapons a lot easier. Maybe. I hope. Well, let's set aside the laser testing for now and move on to the Vulcan Cannon. Now, this thing fires way too rapidly for its own good, so my plan is to measure exactly how many bullets it takes to take out the boss, then figure out how many bullets are fired per second. The result is that it takes 6,400 bullets to defeat the boss, which is kind of a weird number, since it means each individual bullet is doing fractional damage. I also measured that about 200 bullets are fired per second, leading to a DPS rating of 62.5. I watched the bullet counts more closely, and it seems like what's happening is that the number of bullets fired at a time is based on how much an internal timer progresses compared to the actual frame rate, given that I tested this at lower frame rates and got the same results. I'm curious. And now would be a good time to point out that, like many 3D DOS titles in the early 90s, Descent uses a lot of fixed point math, not floating point math. However, unlike a lot of such titles, which would at least try to keep the fractional values out of the metrics, Descent here isn't quite so shy about it. Thus, anything fractional is going to have a degree of inaccuracy, since, after taking a look at the game's source code, I noticed Descent's fixed point math is limited to 65,536 units of precision for the fractional value. Although taking a look at the source did also clue me in on something else that I find interesting about the numerical values presented. They're rounded to the nearest whole numbers. For both performance reasons and for reasons of underlying logic and code, it is very, very rare that a game will treat a decimal value by rounding to the nearest whole number instead of simply truncating the decimal portion. Most games will either always show a decimal value as the next higher whole number or the next lower whole number, i.e. if something has a value of 27.9 or 27.4, typically games will just chop that decimal value off, so you see a whole number of 27 in either case. Descent, however, rounds to the nearest whole number, meaning 27.9 will show up as 28, but 27.4 will show up as 27. This is kinda really important to know once we get into measuring energy usage in a bit, but for now, let's get back to damage ratios. Now that we've established some baselines and have an idea of some of the pitfalls of measuring these things, almost all of the other weapons are going to test much more easily, as I was able to reduce down each weapon's damage capability as the number of full attacks plus number of flares to defeat the level 7 boss, and could use that metric to determine damage per attack. Now, ignoring the quad lasers for now, level 2 lasers take out the boss in 90 attacks plus 21 flares, level 3 lasers take out the boss in 83 attacks plus 9 flares, level 4 lasers take out the boss in 76 attacks plus 25 flares, the spread fire cannon takes out the boss in 66 attacks plus 21 flares, and the plasma cannon takes out the boss in 90 attacks plus 21 flares, which curiously is the exact same metrics as level 2 lasers. Well, once we apply the math we figured out so far, the numbers are spot on. Level 1 lasers do 10 damage per shot, 20 per attack. Level 2 lasers and the plasma cannon are both 11 damage per shot, 22 per attack. Level 3 lasers are 12 damage per shot, 24 per attack. Level 4 lasers are 13 damage per shot, 26 per attack. And the spread fire cannon of all things has the highest damage per attack so far, with 10 per shot, but since it launches 3 shots at a time, deals 30 per attack. However, this is just raw damage. To convert this all into DPS, we need to know the firing rates. This is where things got a little messy because the one weapon I was having trouble nailing down to whole numbers was the plasma cannon. For all levels of lasers, I clocked them as firing 4 pairs of shots per second, while the spread fire cannon was able to do 5 trios of shots per second. But the plasma cannon landed on a very rough 6.25 pairs of shots per second. Now eventually, after looking at the internal data for the game, I at least understood what was going on here, as the internal data simply stores a delay value in seconds before weapons are allowed to fire again. Thus why the plasma cannon's firing rate is so messy, since there's not a clean way to represent 6 shots per second with a short decimal value for the delay. I should also point out that I checked energy too, and all of these weapons use the exact same amount of energy per attack, 0.5. So, let's extend the math and see what all our DPS and energy ratios are. The level 1 lasers are able to do 80 damage per second, level 2 lasers are 88 damage per second, level 3 lasers are 96 damage per second, and level 4 lasers are 104 damage per second. This also gives them energy to damage ratios of 1 to 40, 1 to 44, 1 to 48, and 1 to 52. So yeah, no reason to ever avoid leveling up your lasers. Although, I find it intriguing that the Vulcan Cannon is actually doing less damage per second than even the level 1 lasers. Granted, the Vulcan Cannon does have some extra utility in its extreme rate of fire, since that can end up stunning targets by knocking them around more easily, preventing them from obtaining weapon locks and thus shooting back. Plus, the explosions generated from shooting lava with the Vulcan Cannon can shred through shielding in an instant. And also there's the fact that it doesn't actually use any energy. The spread fire cannon multiplies out to deal 150 damage per second, way higher than even the level 4 lasers, with an energy to damage ratio of 1 to 60, while the plasma cannon, despite the higher rate of fire, only tops out at 137.5 damage per second, with an energy to damage ratio of only 1 to 44, meaning that even though it can do more damage than a pair of level 4 lasers, it's actually outclassed in almost every way by the spread fire cannon. The only thing plasma does better is having a higher rate of fire, which in turn means it'll stun enemies better. Again, because of how weapon impacts impart small amounts of kinetic force. But wait, we haven't factored in quad lasers yet. I intentionally avoided the quad lasers until now because guess what? My testing revealed that quad lasers outclass nearly everything. Since the damage dealt by weapons is directly tied to the shots fired by them, quad lasers not only deal double damage, and not only fire at the same firing rates, but they also consume the same amount of energy per attack. This means quad level 1 lasers have a damage per second rating of 160 with an energy to damage ratio of 1 to 80, quad level 2 lasers have a DPS of 176 with a 1 to 88 ratio, Quad level 3 lasers have a DPS of 192 with a 1:96 ratio, and quad level 4 lasers have a DPS of 208 with a 1:104 ratio. Yeah, the instant you get quad lasers, even if your lasers are still level 1, that will become your most effective weapon for dealing maximum damage at a minimum cost of energy. Although because the lasers only fire 4 times a second, you will need to rely slightly more on your ability to dodge incoming attacks. Except we still have one energy weapon left to figure out. The Fusion Cannon. And this one had some really interesting results, but unfortunately, I wasn't able to narrow it down completely. There's a few reasons why, but the most pertinent reason is because of the way this weapon interacts with enemies and obstacles, given that it passes straight through them, and I wasn't able to determine if the size of a target matters or not, as it wasn't really possible to measure how many times each shot was making contact and dealing damage. Except that there were clear discrepancies between attacking different targets versus the results achieved from using other weapons. The other trouble is that the Fusion Cannon can be charged by holding the fire button down, so that needed its own layer of testing, since if you hold the fire button down for more than 2 seconds, you begin overcharging, which causes you to start taking damage and getting knocked around, getting worse and worse the longer you overcharge for. To that end, the data I came up with against the level 7 boss is still interesting, but it's not the whole story and thus makes the Fusion Cannon a much more situational or preference-based weapon compared to the other offerings. Against the level 7 boss, using instant attacks from the Fusion Cannon without any charging, it takes about 16 attacks or 32 shots plus a few flares to take out the boss, suggesting each individual shot is doing about 60 points of damage. Also, you lose 2 units of energy the instant you press the fire button, and there's a 1-second cooldown after firing before you can fire again. This means if you don't charge the Fusion Cannon, you can do about 120 damage per second with an energy to damage ratio of 1:60. Yeah, even the spread fire cannon outclasses the Fusion Cannon on those grounds just barely. But what if we charge the Fusion Cannon? Well, my testing showed that you burn 1 energy per second of charging, and that you reach maximum safe charge at exactly 2 seconds, after which you begin overcharging, and that maximum safe charge does double damage. Yet, if we do the math, this means fully charged shots, despite doing 120 damage each, 240 for the pair, can only be fired once every 3 seconds, meaning you actually reduce your DPS compared to uncharged shots down to 80 damage per second, while the energy to damage ratio stays the same, 1:60. Also, my testing showed that even though there's no upper limit to how overcharged you can make the Fusion Cannon attacks, the amount of extra damage dealt per second of overcharging is much less than the normal charge rate. Thus, you're doing even less damage per second with an even worse energy ratio when overcharging. Now, while this does mean the Fusion Cannon ends up being a lot less useful against solo targets, it seems to do tremendous damage to reactor cores compared to these findings, and also can hit multiple targets lined up together. Thus, against large groups of enemies, the Fusion Cannon will absolutely be the weapon of choice. But against single targets, you're much better off with quad lasers or the spread fire. And just for sake of reference, let's put the flares up too. Why not? Flares do 1 point of damage each, have a maximum release rate of around 3 per second if you mash right, and also consume 1 point of energy each. Thus, they have a DPS of 3 and an energy to damage ratio of 1:1. I mean, they're not totally useless, but realistically, they're totally useless. Now that's all of the primary weapons, but what about the secondary weapons? Well, these turned out to be the trickiest to measure because every single secondary weapon not only deals damage itself, but also explodes on impact, and those explosions themselves have varying properties, including maximum potential damage and the radius of the blast, whereby the further the center of a target is from the center of the blast, the less damage the blast will do. Because of this, the results I came up with are not the actual numbers being used in the game, since these numbers are the combined effect of a direct impact and the blast damage. but it's the best I could do. Also, for the proximity mines in particular, I had to get creative with getting them to deal damage appropriately, since normally they drop in place, but they do actually carry your ship's momentum for a bit before coming to a stop. So with some careful maneuvering, I was able to get them to slam into the level 1 reactor and measure their damage output in that manner. Also, every secondary weapon in the game has a maximum firing rate of 2 launches per second, but since the ammo is limited, I think the more useful metric here will be how much damage each launch will do on average for a direct impact, and how much damage you can expect to deal from a full load of those weapons. For concussion missiles, the average damage of a direct hit was about 45, meaning a full load of 20 can deal a maximum of 900 points of damage. Homing missiles are actually slightly more powerful than concussion missiles, dealing about 50 damage each, but you can only hold 10 at a time, so you get 500 points of damage out of a full load. Proximity mines were similar to concussion missiles, about 45 damage each, but with a stock limit of 10, that means you can only do up to 450 damage from a full load. But then we get to smart missiles and mega missiles. Well, let's go out of order and do mega missiles first, since they're more straightforward. They have a massive blast radius on impact and appear to do a ridiculous amount of damage, thus they're best suited to taking out bosses or large groups of enemies, with the average damage of a direct impact being about 335, meaning a full load of 5 can do about 1,675 points of damage to a single target. Now, since mega missiles have such a strong reliance on hitting multiple enemies at a time though, I decided to compare these results versus the internal data I had access to, and found out that mega missiles supposedly do 199 damage on a direct impact. Not entirely sure why they chose 199 instead of a flat 200, but what that means is that the blast radius itself may not actually be all that powerful. Though based on the blast radius numbers, the mega missiles have a blast radius which is almost triple the size of the blast radius of the concussion missiles, which means you really don't want to be anywhere close to these things when they detonate. But then finally, smart missiles. On direct impacts with smart missiles seem to do an average of 235 damage, thus a full load of 5 could potentially do up to 1,175 points of damage. But smart missiles have a unique effect in that the missile itself doesn't home in on targets, but upon impact will release a burst of 6 plasma orbs which do home in on nearby targets. Plus, the way the impact is handled, those orbs will always burst outward away from the surface which is hit, meaning unless there's a rare glitch in the collision logic, all 6 orbs will get released on impact. And with direct hits, those orbs just immediately home in on the target you hit and deal their damage. To that end, I was able to separate out the smart missile's direct damage and the damage dealt by the plasma orbs released, and found that the impact of the smart missile itself was only doing about 25 damage on average, while each individual plasma orb had a damage output of 35, meaning all 6 together equates to 210 points of damage. And yeah, that's all the damage values I could figure out. I mean, technically you can also damage things by ramming into them, but you lose shields too when you do that, and some enemies have melee attacks, so that's not always a smart idea. Plus, some things can't actually be damaged by ramming them. In fact, a very easy way to tell if you ramming a target is hurting said target or not is, are you losing shields? If you are, you're hurting the target. If you're not, you're doing nothing to it, as evidenced by the fact that I can ram a reactor core all day long and neither me nor it suffers a single point of damage. And again, I was able to find some raw stats to compare this to, but unfortunately those raw stats are primarily for Descent 2, not the original game. And I know a lot of damage values were tweaked going from the original game to the sequel. Thus, the only way to pull the proper values for Descent anymore would be to extract them from the game's resource files and then decompile them into something readable, and that's well beyond the scope of what most people are even capable of doing, given the nature of Descent's data files. Not to mention, I've found a number of other online sources which contradict this data as well, which kind of goes to show just how obfuscated the original Descent's damage outputs were made to be. Now, I did have a thought about maybe trying to do this with the multiplayer mode, running 2 instances of the game at the same time and connecting the emulation instances together with their own IPX network tunnel. But even though I did get this working, I ultimately decided against doing it this way because I realized it'd potentially take more effort to produce similar results, and while those results may have been easier to read, I remembered that some weapons like the smart missiles and mega missiles could frequently one-shot opponents in multiplayer. Thus, testing the weapons in that manner was only going to get me so far, so I'd need another method one way or another. And lastly, I elected not to compile these results into a final table to download as I usually would because, again, the results aren't conclusive for a lot of the weapons involved, and I don't like finalizing data into downloadable formats unless I can be very certain of the results. Regardless though, these results at least help to validate my decision to use the spread fire cannon over the plasma cannon back when I was a kid. Even though quad lasers of any level of power beat the pants off of both of those choices. Anywho, that'll be all for today's ADG Pro video. Next up will be a proper review, episode 339, where we're going to be taking a look at a first-person dungeon crawl which by all accounts looks like it should be related to Dungeons & Dragons, or maybe The Elder Scrolls, or Ultima Underworld, but nope, it's not related to any of those. Yeah, make sure to stay tuned to check out one of the competitors to those franchises. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to all the people seen here supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to join in with them and support the show directly, head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.